Life has a way of throwing surprises at you when you least expect them. One moment, you're going about your usual routine. In the next, you're sitting in a doctor's office, staring at a diagnosis that changes everything. Mortality had always been an abstract concept to me, something distant, something that happened to other people. But when the doctor looked at me with that serious expression and explained what they had found, it became real. The tests weren't conclusive yet, but the words potentially terminal hit harder than anything I had ever faced. I walked out of that office in a daze, barely remembering how I got home. I had spent years planning for the future, saving, working, thinking ahead. And now, suddenly, the future wasn't guaranteed. Rachel was home when I got there, moving about the kitchen like any normal evening. She barely looked up when I walked in. For some reason, I expected something different, as if my internal panic should have somehow translated to the rest of the world. I told her what the doctor had said, expecting some kind of reaction, shock, sadness, maybe even anger at the unfairness of it all. Instead, she barely flinched. A vague nod, a muttered response, and then she moved on to talking about her plans for the next day. I was too overwhelmed to process it at the time, brushing off her reaction as her way of coping. Some people shut down in the face of bad news. Maybe that's all it was. Over the next few weeks, the appointments became more frequent. Blood work, scans, discussions about treatment options. Every time I sat in that waiting room, I wondered if this was it, if my time was officially running out. And every time I came home, Rachel seemed less and less engaged. She stopped asking questions. She barely noticed when I had to leave for another test. The woman who used to worry about me catching a cold was now completely indifferent to whether I lived or died. At first, I convinced myself that she was struggling in her own way, that she was distancing herself out of fear. But then I started noticing the changes. The late nights became more frequent. The excuses started stacking up. At first, it was work meetings that ran long. Then it was last-minute plans with friends. The explanations were always vague, always lacking detail, and every time I tried to engage, she brushed it off. I wanted to believe it was just a coincidence, that I was reading too much into things because of my own emotional state. But the signs were there, and once I started seeing them, I couldn't unsee them. She started dressing differently, putting more effort into her appearance in a way that felt out of place given everything that was happening. She was more guarded with her phone, tilting it away from me when she checked messages, always making sure it was locked when she left the room. She seemed lighter, happier, like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. And that's when it hit me. She wasn't upset about my condition. She wasn't struggling to cope. She was waiting. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was just my mind twisting reality because of the stress. But the moment I overheard her on the phone one night, everything became clear. It was late, and I had woken up feeling nauseous. I got out of bed quietly, planning to grab a glass of water from the kitchen, when I heard her talking in hushed tones. Her voice was softer, warmer than it ever was when she spoke to me these days. At first, I thought maybe she was finally opening up to someone about everything, maybe confiding in a friend. But then I caught the words. She wasn't talking about how scared she was. She wasn't talking about how unfair it all felt. She was talking about the future, a future that no longer included me. She laughed, a genuine, carefree laugh I hadn't heard in years, and then said something that made my stomach turn. She just had to hold on a little longer. Soon, everything would be different. I stood there, gripping the edge of the counter, feeling like the air had been sucked out of the room. My wife wasn't grieving me. She wasn't devastated by the idea of losing me. She was already moving on. She had already decided that I was gone. And then, as if the universe hadn't twisted the knife deep enough, I went in for another round of tests the following week. But this time, the news was different. The initial diagnosis had been wrong. What they had first suspected was far worse than what was actually happening. My condition was treatable. It would take time, but I wasn't dying. My future wasn't over. But Rachel didn't know that. I sat in the car outside the hospital, gripping the steering wheel as the realization settled in. The woman I had spent over a decade building a life with had been waiting for me to disappear. She had already detached herself, already planned for the next phase of her life, one where I was nothing more than a memory. And that's when I made a decision. I wasn't going to tell her. Not yet. I needed to see just how deep this betrayal went. I needed to know exactly what kind of person I had married. Because the moment she had decided to stop pretending, she had given me the greatest gift of all. The ability to leave her before she ever had the chance to leave me. The moment I decided to keep my diagnosis a secret, everything changed. The fear that had gripped me for weeks was replaced by something else, clarity. Rachel had already started treating me like a fading shadow, a loose end she was waiting to be rid of. And now, I had the chance to see just how far she was willing to go before she thought I was out of the picture completely. I didn't act any differently at first. If she had spent all this time assuming I was too exhausted, too distracted, too weak to notice the shift in her behavior, I wasn't about to prove her wrong. Instead, I paid attention. I let her believe I was still unaware, still lost in my own battle while she carried on with whatever new life she was envisioning. And the more I watched, the worse it became. She barely spoke to me unless it was necessary. The obligatory check-ins, the half-hearted questions about my day that she barely waited for an answer to. There was no sadness, no worry, no desperation to make things right. She had already disconnected, her mind somewhere else, her heart no longer here. And now that I knew what to look for, I saw the patterns more clearly than ever. The late nights weren't just a coping mechanism. They were intentional. The quick glances at her phone, the way she would leave the room whenever a certain message popped up, the extra effort she put into her appearance on days she had no reason to. She was careful, but not careful enough. I checked our shared bank account one evening, something I had rarely ever done before. A handful of transactions stood out immediately. Restaurants I had never been to, bar tabs that didn't match any nights we had spent together, charges for hotel bars that were conveniently located nowhere near her supposed work events. And just like that, I had my answer. I started digging deeper, but I knew I had to be smart about it. If I confronted her too soon, she would twist it. She would cry. She would gaslight me. She would make me feel like I was the one ruining everything in the last moments of my life. But I wasn't dying. I was very much alive, and I was about to make sure she had no idea what was coming. The first step was to test her. I started asking more questions, just small ones at first. Casual curiosity about her nights out, about the people she was seeing, about why she seemed so absent. She was good at deflecting, but I could see it in her eyes. Annoyance, not sadness. She wasn't hurt that I was slipping away. She was irritated that I was still paying attention. Then, I pushed a little further. I mentioned feeling worse, exaggerating my symptoms just enough to see how she would react. If she still cared, even the smallest part of her, she would have shown it. But all she did was nod, almost distracted, barely acknowledging it. She didn't ask if I needed anything. She didn't ask if I was scared. She just nodded, like someone counting down the days. It wasn't until I checked the GPS history in her car that I finally found what I had been waiting for. A series of repeated locations, all circling back to the same place. Not a friend's house, not her workplace, but an apartment across town. She had someone else. The confirmation hit me harder than I expected, even though I had already known the truth. There was something different about seeing it laid out in front of me, about knowing that she wasn't just waiting for me to die. She had already moved on. She had been sneaking around, seeing someone else, setting up her next chapter while I was supposed to be fading into the background. And I had let her. That night, I lay in bed beside her, staring at the ceiling while she slept soundly, completely unaware that her entire plan was about to fall apart. She had no idea that I wasn't dying. No idea that I knew everything. No idea that I had already started making moves to leave her before she ever got the chance to leave me. And that was the part that made me smile. Because Rachel thought she had one. She thought she had secured her way out, that she had played the perfect game. But she had underestimated me. She had spent months preparing for my absence, never realizing that soon, she would be the one left behind. I had imagined the moment 100 different ways, picturing her face when she realized that everything she thought she had under control was slipping away. I had expected anger, denial, maybe even desperate justifications. But when I finally told Rachel the truth, she didn't react the way I thought she would. I had waited for the perfect moment, letting her lies stack up until the weight of them was unbearable. She thought she was in the clear, that I was too consumed by my illness to notice her late nights, the secrecy, the way she had emotionally detached herself from our marriage. She thought she had time. That was her mistake. When I finally confronted her, laying out every piece of evidence, she didn't lash out. She didn't even try to deny it. Instead, she collapsed into tears, sobbing so hard I thought she might actually collapse under the weight of it. Her hands clutched at me like I was a lifeline she was afraid to lose, her body shaking as she gasped out her apologies. She told me she had been struggling, that she had felt trapped inside her own mind for months, that my illness, what she thought was my impending death, had sent her into a spiral of depression she hadn't known how to escape from. She said she wasn't herself, that the weight of waiting for me to die had broken something inside of her. She had made mistakes, terrible ones, but she hadn't meant to. She swore she still loved me, that she had just been scared, lost, trying to distract herself from the crushing reality of losing me. And that's when it happened. I felt it, regret, not for confronting her, not for exposing the truth, but for the fact that, in my anger, I had ignored the possibility that maybe she was suffering in her own way. Maybe she hadn't been waiting for me to die so she could be free. Maybe she had been waiting for it because she didn't know how to function without me. Maybe her betrayal wasn't calculated cruelty, but an act of self-destruction from someone who didn't know how to process grief. For the first time since this had all started, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt tired. I had spent weeks preparing for this moment, thinking I would feel satisfaction when she finally broke, but all I felt was exhaustion. I had expected a heartless, selfish woman, someone who had discarded me before I was even gone. Instead, I saw someone unraveling before my eyes, someone who was crumbling under the weight of her own guilt. She begged me not to leave. She promised to be better, to fix things, to do whatever it took to rebuild what we had lost. She swore she would go to therapy, that she would fight for us, that she would prove to me that she was still the woman I had loved. And for a moment, just a moment, I considered it. Because no matter how much she had hurt me, no matter how much I wanted to hate her, the truth was that part of me still loved her. Part of me wanted to believe that this was something we could fix, that what we had built wasn't entirely gone. But then I thought about all the nights she had left me alone, all the lies, all the times she had looked at me and seen nothing but a future inconvenience instead of a husband. And I knew I could never go back, even if she meant every word. Even if she truly was broken, truly regretted everything she had done. The damage was too deep. The foundation had crumbled, and no amount of apologies could rebuild it. I had spent so much time planning to leave her, imagining her regret, hoping that she would finally understand what she had done. And now, standing there, watching her sob in front of me, I realized I had already won. But it didn't feel like a victory. It just felt like an ending. Forgiving Rachel wasn't something that happened in an instant. It wasn't like flipping a switch or undoing the past with a single decision. It was slow, hesitant, uncertain. But in that moment, as I watched her sob, as I saw the desperation in her eyes, something inside me softened. Maybe it was love. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was just the simple fact that I wanted to believe she meant it. So I stayed. For the first time in what felt like forever, Rachel acted like the woman I had married. She was attentive, present, loving in a way I hadn't seen in years. She threw herself into proving that she was serious about making things right. She made dinner, held my hand, checked on me constantly like she used to. She told me she had booked a therapy appointment, that she was ready to deal with her issues. And for a while, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, we had found our way back to each other. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like a ghost in my own home. I wasn't just waiting for something to end. I was living again. We spent long nights talking, real conversations, not just the surface-level pleasantries we had fallen into. She opened up about her fears, her depression, the way she had spiraled when she thought she was losing me. I listened. I understood, and slowly, I let my guard down. We laughed again. We went out for dinner. We sat together on the couch without the usual silence hanging between us. It was good. Too good. The kind of good that makes you suspicious. The kind that makes you feel like you're in the eye of the storm and don't even realize it. Did you think we were going to live happily ever after? So did I. But Rachel didn't think so. One evening, about a month after I had forgiven her, I had to drive out of town for a routine checkup with a specialist. Rachel had offered to come with me, but I told her it wasn't necessary. It was a long drive, and I figured she could use the time to relax at home. She kissed me goodbye, told me to text her when I got there, and watched me pull out of the driveway with what I thought was genuine warmth in her eyes. The drive was quiet, peaceful even. I listened to music, let myself enjoy the rare moment of solitude. But about an hour in, I realized I had left my insurance paperwork sitting on my desk at home. Without it, the appointment would be a waste of time. I turned the car around. The house was dark when I pulled up, which I found odd. Rachel had always been someone who left lights on, even when she was home alone. I figured she had gone out, maybe to clear her head or run errands. But as I stepped inside, I noticed something strange. Her car keys were still on the hook by the door. I wasn't sure why, but my stomach twisted. Something felt off. I walked further inside, making my way toward the office to grab my paperwork, when I heard something. A voice. Not Rachel's. A man's voice. It was muffled, distant, coming from somewhere in the house. My pulse quickened, and for a split second, I thought maybe she had the TV on. But as I moved closer, the voices became clearer, low and laughing, the kind of laughter that made my skin crawl. Then, I heard her. I should have been furious. I should have felt my blood boil, my hands tremble, my vision go red. But instead, I felt nothing. A strange, eerie calm settled over me, like I had already known this moment was coming. Like a part of me had been waiting for it. I followed the sound, moving quietly, my footsteps careful against the hardwood floor. I reached the bedroom door, which was slightly ajar. I didn't need to push it open. I saw enough. Rachel, the woman I had forgiven, the woman who had cried in my arms, who had sworn she would change, who had promised she would spend the rest of her life proving herself to me. She was tangled up with another man in our bed, the sheets a mess, her hands gripping him the way she used to grip me. And the worst part? She didn't even look guilty. She didn't flinch, didn't freeze in horror at being caught. No, she laughed. A slow, breathless laugh, like she didn't have a care in the world. Like this was just another moment, another secret she thought she could get away with. All good things must come to an end sooner or later. And in that moment, I realized that Rachel had never intended for this to be good at all. I stood there for a moment, watching, letting the reality of it settle in. The woman I had forgiven, the woman I had given a second chance, had thrown it all away without a second thought. I had given her an opportunity to prove herself, to make things right, and instead, she had chosen to spit in my face. The laugh was what did it. That smug, carefree laugh as if she had already won. As if I was nothing. As if I was just some fool she could keep playing until she was ready to discard me. But she had it backward. She was the one about to be discarded. I turned away without a word, without an ounce of hesitation, walking back through the house she would never set foot in again. I didn't stop to hear her excuses, didn't wait for her to chase after me with some half-baked apology or pathetic sob story. I had heard enough of those to last a lifetime. There was nothing left to say. She had made her choices. Now, I was going to make mine. The first thing I did was go straight to the closet and start pulling out every single thing that belonged to her. Clothes, shoes, makeup, jewelry, anything that had even the slightest connection to her. I didn't take my time, didn't care about keeping things neat. I ripped open drawers, yanked clothes off hangers, and tossed everything into garbage bags. Then, I dragged it all outside. The street was empty, the sun beginning to set, casting long shadows over the pavement. I didn't care if anyone saw. In fact, I wanted them to. I wanted the world to see what happened when someone played the long game and lost. One by one, I dumped the bags on the sidewalk. Her expensive handbags, the dresses she used to wear when she went out with the girls, the little things I had once bought her as gifts, thinking they meant something. They meant nothing, just like she did. By the time I was done, the pile was impossible to miss. It was as if her entire existence had been packed up and thrown away in the span of minutes, because that's exactly what had happened. I went back inside, and for the first time in a long time, I felt nothing but calm. I walked straight to my desk, pulled out my laptop, and filed for divorce. No delays, no hesitation, no second thoughts. The paperwork was submitted before she even had the chance to step out of that bedroom, before she even realized that her entire world had just crumbled beneath her feet. When she finally stumbled outside, her face was a mess of shock and confusion, wrapped in nothing but the bedsheet she had probably just used to cheat on me. Her eyes darted between the pile of her belongings and me, disbelief written all over her face. She opened her mouth to speak, but I had already turned away. I didn't care what she had to say. She had already said enough. The last thing I did before I locked the door behind her was change the locks. She was out. For good.